Most people think that Donald Trump's America First strategy is all about trade wars and fiery tweets. But that's not the whole story. Not even close. What if I told you that the new national security strategy is the blueprint for the biggest shift in America's global role in over a generation? This isn't just another foreign policy paper. It's a plan to protect the entire Western Hemisphere, to pressure drug cartels, control immigration, and bring back jobs to the United States. This is the story of how the administration's boldest move could reshape the world and your wallet.
You're listening to Uncle Sam Saves America, a patriotic show for the average Joe.
The document that landed in Washington in late 2025 wasn't just another policy paper. The new National Security Strategy, or NSS, lays out a vision that some analysts are already calling the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a 19th century policy that warned European powers to keep out of the Western Hemisphere. This new thinking takes the same idea and applies it to today's rivals, mainly China and Russia. And since the Clinton era, American foreign policy was built on the idea that U.S. interests were tied to the stability of the entire globe. The new strategy doesn't junk that idea completely, but it does narrow the focus dramatically. It signals a shift away from being the world's policeman to becoming the hemisphere's guardian. Looking at the document, the administration seems to see three main threats in our own backyard: uncontrolled mass migration, powerful drug cartels, and the growing influence of China. So what does that actually mean? Well, the strategy prioritizes denying powers from outside the hemisphere the ability to threaten the U.S. from next door. Commentators believe that this is a push to counter China and Russia's ability to position military forces, control strategic assets such as ports and mines, or wield power economically in the region. This is a huge change. For years, the U.S. was all about globalization, but this strategy puts the Americas, North, Central, and South, front and center over global order. The goal is to reassert U.S. dominance in its own neighborhood, an influence many in the administration feel has been slipping away. Supporters call it a logical, necessary correction, focusing American money and muscle on the most direct threats. But critics, especially in Latin America, are asking a more simple question. If Washington pushes out Chinese investment in huge projects like ports and dams, will the American companies actually step up, or will the region's development just grind to a halt? The second pillar of this strategy draws a much tougher line on border security and transnational criminal groups. The new strategy elevates the fight against narcotics to a top national security priority, with the goal of neutralizing cartels long before their influence reaches the U.S. border. One of the most talked about and controversial ideas being pushed is the designation of major Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. It's a hotly debated proposal that the Mexican government has fiercely opposed, worried it could greenlight unilateral U.S. military action on their soil. But if it were to happen, it would be more than just a name change. It would open the door to targeting anyone providing material support to these groups, from handling their money to providing them with supplies, with severe legal penalties. This not only stops the drugs, but shuts down the entire network that is also used for even more nefarious purposes, such as human trafficking. This move is seen by some analysts as a potential step toward giving U.S. intelligence community broader authority to gather military-style intelligence on these groups. Along those lines, this strategy signals a far more assertive military posture. While the U.S. military has long supported drug interdiction by spotting and tracking smugglers, this new strategy suggests a more aggressive role, and I think we've seen some of that in the Gulf of America. It calls for using naval ships, aircraft, and intelligence sharing with partners to crush the cartels. However, existing U.S. and international law makes this kind of military escalation complicated. On immigration, the strategy is blunt. It calls for ending mass migration and makes it clear that a primary goal is forcing regional governments to stop illegal migration and take back their citizens who we deport. This puts migration control at the very center of diplomacy with America's neighbors. If you're finding this analysis valuable, consider following us on Rumble. We break down what shapes our world 3 times a week. The third part of this doctrine is all about money, and it's just as ambitious. Build a more secure America by rewiring the entire hemisphere's supply chains. The pandemic taught us that economic security is national security. The strategy hopes to get there with a mix of tariffs, incentives, and diplomatic arm twisting designed to push nearshoring or reshoring of America's manufacturing. The goal is simple: to bring back American manufacturing jobs here to the United States. And for the jobs that don't come back or can't come back, move them away from places like China to countries here in the Western Hemisphere. It's kind of the classic carrot and stick approach. Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of broad across-the-board tariffs to make foreign goods more expensive. On the other hand, tax breaks and subsidies are being discussed to convince companies to build new factories in the United States, especially for critical goods like medicine and microchips. This is a direct challenge to China's economic power in Latin America. And over the last 2 decades, China has become South America's top trading partner and a huge investor in infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative. The new U.S. strategy sees that as a major threat. Analysts in Washington believe that it's gearing up to counter China's presence in the region with their ports, telecom networks, and energy sectors. This new dynamic is already putting pressure on the regional governments who may be forced to choose between an American-led economic bloc and deeper ties with Beijing. This new strategy implies that those who play ball with the U.S. on nearshoring, counter-narcotics, and immigration could get rewards like better market access and higher investments. But this plan is loaded with risks. Many companies are reluctant to make huge long-term investments based on policies that could flip after the next election. On top of that, U.S. labor is expensive, and rebuilding entire supply chains is a massive undertaking. In fact, some companies leaving China aren't coming to the Americas at all. They're headed to places like Vietnam and India to get around the tariffs. But this new strategy will hopefully take care of that. When you focus this intensely on your own hemisphere, it's going to send ripples everywhere else, especially to traditional allies in Europe and Asia. The message is pretty direct. The days of America footing the bill for the entire world are over. For Europe, this strategy doubles down on the demand for allies to pay more for their own defense within NATO. The strategy essentially ties America's commitment to collective defense to Europe taking on a far more cost and responsibility. Many European allies see this as less burden sharing and more as burden shifting, but the fact is they have not been paying their fair share for decades. This document is also sharply critical of some of Europe's economic and immigration policies, creating friction with EU leaders who see it as U.S. meddling. And while the commitment to NATO is still there on paper, the tone suggests a more limited and conditional American role. In Asia, the policy is more of a continuation of the last few years with a focus on free and open Indo-Pacific trade and strengthening partners against China. With so much emphasis being placed on the Western Hemisphere, allies like Japan and South Korea are a little worried how much resources and how much attention the U.S. could give them in a real crisis. The strategy also shows a deep skepticism toward big multilateral groups and foreign aid, viewing them as tools that have often failed to serve American interests. This approach isn't to tear everything down, but to reshape these institutions so that they more directly benefit the United States. It's a transactional view of the world that prizes bilateral deals and concrete results over shared ideology. In conclusion, the new national security strategy lays out a vision for a United States that's pulling back from being the global policeman to becoming a fortified guardian in its own hemisphere. It's a three-part playbook. First, reassert dominance in the Americas with a more modern take on the Monroe Doctrine, pushing back hard against rivals like Russia and China. Second, get tough on the border and the cartels, floating new legal and military tools to do it. And third is to use the threat of tariffs and the promise of incentives to force rewiring of the global economy, pulling jobs and supply chains back to the Americas. Supporters will call this long overdue and a realistic strategy that protects America's security and jobs. The big question is, will this grand strategy actually make America safer and richer? Or will it just lead to a more isolated and vulnerable nation in an increasingly broken world? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Anyway, thanks for listening to me today.
You're listening to Uncle Sam Saves America, a patriotic show for the average Joe.